Welcome, everyone, to Conversations for Change with Margaret and Anya. And as you all know, we like to speak to thought leaders, academics, and experts that are really doing the kind of work and providing the kinds of insights that could provide leadership to us in these uncertain times. And we are excited to have today Brian Iselin, who is... I keep doing that, right, Brian? Anyway, Brian Iselin.
No problem. It's spelled Iselin, right? So
Right. No, it isn't. I should know better. Brian Iselin.
Yes.
And I'm not going to cut this out of the recording. Let's have fun with
it. You don't need
right?
to. It's fun. Yeah.
Right. Brian Iselin, who is the CEO of Slave Free Trade and doing some incredible work tracking human rights abuses across supply chains worldwide. And we are excited to get deep into what you're doing and how people can get involved and support what you're doing as well. So let's kick it off by getting to know you a little bit, Brian. One of the questions we like to ask at the top is, how did you get involved in the work that you're doing? And you can tell it in any way you want to tell it. It could be a story, something that happened to you that really catalyzed you to do this kind of work in the world.
Okay. Well, the easiest way to say it is that actually my career, even though if you looked at my CV or my LinkedIn profile, you'd think it seems rather a dogleg career, that in fact there's a red thread. And the red thread has been strongly around it's going to sound messianic, but helping people and giving, standing up for those people who, really could use someone standing up for them. And so I started early as a soldier, and then I became a federal agent. And as a federal agent, I specialized in counter-organized crime, and I served abroad. So I'm Australian and now Swedish as well, but I'm originally an Australian federal agent and soldier. So I served abroad in that capacity. So I was a federal agent in China and working for Australia, and principally focused on counter narcotics. Right, that was the number one priority. And in so doing, came across a case of the trafficking of babies for adoptions. And so these were babies in sports bags in the bottom of buses. Real horror story stuff. And it really changed my life. Right, suddenly counter narcotics didn't seem actually so important. So I decided to start focusing on that. I've also always had a bit of a problem with authority since I was a kid, which is strange for a soldier and a federal agent, but had a problem with authority. So when the Australian government said to me, that's none of our business, there was no way I was going to do that, right? There is a greater good, and there is something that transcends national interest and self-interest. In the cases of human trafficking, it's a global issue. So it became very important to me. And after a couple of years starting to specialize in counter-human trafficking, came across my very first case that was classified as something else, that is forced labor and child labor. So a case that was actually human trafficking, forced labor, child labor, and slavery and servitude, which are the four kind of legal classes, if you like, of international law. A case that was all four at once. And the fact that it was all four cases mattered not at all to the victims of this, right? So this was a boy who was shot in the head and thrown overboard from a prawn boat, and he was trafficked, he was in forced labor, he was in child labor, and he was in slavery and servitude. So the legal definitions suddenly felt very pale to me and actually completely irrelevant, because there was nothing in the legal definitions. And the legal definitions ended up not helping anybody. Nobody was ever prosecuted for that.
And are they, I'm jumping in, but are those that you spoke about the four different ways in which we look at those types of crimes, and it didn't mean anything in that particular situation you're talking about. Are they treated differently in terms of the amount of proof, that the evidence that has to be brought, or
Well, so they all have their own different legal implementation. So they're all different points of international law. Mm-hmm. They come from the definition of human trafficking comes from the Palermo Protocol to the Organized Crime Convention. Slavery and servitude comes from the old, from the old League of Nations definition. So they each have their own definition in international law, and they're each implemented differently in national laws. So you'll find human trafficking laws in the United States differ from human trafficking laws in Vietnam, for instance. So they're all implemented slightly differently. Proofs differ, but they are four distinct legal cases, right?
And do they have
and
different?
there's overlap, right? So something that you wanted to prosecute as a human trafficking case, for instance, could also be forced labor, and maybe you don't have the proofs that you need for human trafficking, which are actually a stronger set of proofs. Then you might be able to get somebody up on forced labor, but then there might actually be no criminal law that relates to it. Human trafficking comes from a law enforcement protocol. Forced labor and child labor, they come from the Child Rights Convention and the Forced Labor Convention, so they're implemented differently at national level. So there may actually not even be anything very serious to use against somebody for forced labor. So it's almost like in some ways it might be the difference between manslaughter and murder. So they are very different, or can be very different. So
and
in any case,
sorry, I'm jumping in while you're telling your story, but I actually do want to understand this. So, and they're probably different arms of the state, different institutional machinery for the different types of.
Completely, because of the source of law.
Right.
And none of these are dealt with by human rights institutions. So, for example, you never get what we've actually got for human trafficking is the Palermo Protocol, which comes from the Organized Crime Convention. It's a law enforcement convention. It's not a human rights convention. So, in fact, all of the responses that are elaborated in that, and the clear focus of 80%, 90% of that document is law enforcement. So it doesn't address, for example, very well, at least, it doesn't address the demand side of the equation. So it leaves out a very big piece. It leaves out cause, actually. Right. It doesn't address causes. So that's very important. The state responses differ very much, even just within human trafficking, but then from human trafficking to forced labor. Forced labor is Department of Labor or Ministry of Labor in most places. Child labor tends to be either Ministry of Labor or police or social services. Or,
so you were involved in this case where all four applied.
Where all four, the case could have been could have met the conditions under all four situations, but in fact, what it ended up being was nobody was interested in doing anything about it, actually, or able to do anything about it. So, so anyway, but my point was that the irrelevance. I've been working in law enforcement up until that point. I've been working in a kind of criminal justice world for 15 years, and so for me to see that this real world dreadful problem was actually not being addressed because it was because the legal definitions actually didn't mean very much on the ground. They don't mean so much to the victims of the crime. So that stuck with me. That was really a painful lesson, to be frank, because I'd kind of invested my life in up until that point in criminal justice. So, and the other painful thing was, and this is also something that stuck with me. So this is all part of the journey. Sorry, it's a really long story, but it's all part of the journey to where I am. So one of the other things that stuck with me was during the investigation, we found where the prawns went to, right, from the boats that this boy was on. So the prawns ended up in supermarket freezers across Europe after a torturous 12-step supply chain journey across the world. Anyway, they ended up in freezers. And the thing that struck me right at that very point was that there was nothing a consumer in Paris looking at the freezer, the prawns in the freezer, nothing they could tell about those prawns that was useful to them and could differentiate those prawns from the bag next to them. And yet right way down at the fishing fleet, there were boats next to the ones. In the same fleet, there were boats who were treating their people very, very well. So there was not a single differentiator from the consumer right down to the boat that said, these are caught by slaves and these are caught by free people. There is nothing on the packaging to help. So the consumer is blind to it. The retailer is blind to it. Everywhere down the supply chain is blind to it from the very first point of sale. So, and that's a very powerful realization when you think about it, because if we're completely blind to the conditions right through the chain, from the farm gate price, let's say, there is actually nothing to differentiate slave made and slave free. So what I wanted to do was explore. been working in the kind of behavioral economics field for quite some time as well, and doing research in this field. So what I wanted to explore was whether it was possible to introduce a differentiator, so that and then communicate that differentiator down a value chain or along a value chain, so that if we could introduce something that could change the decision of the consumer at the other end, could that be harnessed? Could that be multiplied sufficient times? And can it be passed on down the chain in such a way that the message gets right through to the very bottom of the global commodity chain that we're talking about, that gives a leg up to those organizations and businesses doing the right thing? Because the good boat captain is selling their prawns for exactly the same price as the shitty boat captain. And that shouldn't be. We should be incentivizing products that are made without harming anybody, instead of allowing that to be the norm in the global economy. 80% of what we buy and see has been touched by modern slavery. It should be the other way around. The numbers have to be inverted. So to do that, we need to come up with something very positive and behavioral. So that's where I came up with the idea for slave-free trade.
When was that?
It was actually 2 a.m. on the 23rd of November, 2016.
Wow.
I woke up with the logo and the name in my head, and by 6
Really?
a.m., by the time everybody got up for breakfast, the logo was drawn, the website was registered, and I was just going to do it. You know, I had the plan to study it, was going to start a PhD in behavioral economics and study it, and then I just woke up and said, I'm just going to do it instead.
A real catalyst,
didn't really know what or how, but I just knew that there was this possibility that we could introduce this as a market differentiator and use market forces to make great change, to make significant change. Because in fact, when you think about it, and we've learned the same thing from the global illicit drugs market, supply side measures are rather futile. They can never change the dynamics of the market. They can displace supply at best. They can disrupt supply at best. They can never change the dynamics of the market. So while you're only doing something on the supply side, so in counter narcotics, this is crop eradication and arrests and seizures and interceptions and things like this. While you're only working on the supply side, you're not changing the dynamics. There's actually more drugs, and you're putting more profit back into the system by just working on the supply side. If you're not reducing demand, you're not changing anything. It's the same with human trafficking. If we're not talking about cause, then we're not doing anything. We can talk about poverty eradication until the cows come home, and anything we do on poverty is important, but it should never be confused with solving modern slavery. It can't. It's not a cause.
So you said that you're changing the market, right? I want to understand.
Intending to change the market. Yes.
All right, so intending to change, but
we're just new, right?
What is the strategy that you are implementing or intending to implement? Is it that you try to, because you previously said that there's 80% of all the products and services that have been touched by the slave trade. I'm actually surprised by these numbers, and obviously you have some statistics behind you that are backed by the research that has been made. And I do assume that, you know, everyone that is part of that supply chain, at one point in time, they have been presented with that statistics, and they had decided to not do anything. So is the strategy to kind of shame them so that the market separates the good from the bad, or is the strategy to inform the consumer, or what is it?
So the strategy is creating a behavioral feedback loop. So the best way to describe that is we collect the data from workplaces about which workplaces are good. So that way we're getting a picture of what products have been made not harming anybody, proved to not harm anybody. And then we communicate that to the potential buyers of that at a point where they're making their buying decision. So the simplest way to describe it is a distributed human rights intelligence system. So we find out what's going on in a workplace based on human rights conditions, and we communicate that to a consumer in a store, for example, with a social what's called a social label to provoke a certain behavior on a product. So we put this on a chocolate bar or put it on a coffee, so that the consumer gets to make a choice. And you do it at point of sale. So because you've got about 7 seconds within a consumer buying something to be able to convince them to change their buying pattern. So you present this as decision intelligence in a way to a consumer and get them to change their way. That signal multiplied many times gets communicated to the retailer, of course, through the Simple Purchase Act. And then that gets communicated on down the supply chain. The message continues quite intact right through the supply chain. So what we want to do is turn supply chains where none of these actors know anything about the conditions into networks where they all know about the conditions. And if they're participating in that network, they then become collaborators in that network. They become responsible for each other's and interested in each other's human rights performance, because ultimately the chocolate bar on the shelf at the other end requires them to know those things. So it's about this kind of human rights transparency, promoting human rights transparency within this chain so that they all become reliant on each other. So that's the system we're doing.
I enter the store because I just want to get a really right picture of how this information is being distributed among the stakeholders in the chain, right?
Sure.
So as a consumer, I come to the store and I see a product labeled with slave-free trade and a product that is not labeled at all. So I assume that you approached, or whomever the retailer or producer approached you in order to put that stamp on the product. Now, the product that doesn't have that stamp on, how do I know that this is not just due to you guys not knowing each other because, you know, this is a new product on the market, or because this product has been indeed approached but refused to cooperate?
You don't know. You just know that they're not slave-free.
Okay.
The intention is to create.
We just know that they cannot demonstrate using your label that they're not slave-free. We
can't know. We can't know anything about them. The simple fact of the matter is the T-shirt or the chocolate bar next to the one that is slave-free, you can only tell what you could tell now about it. You can't tell anything more. So we're adding another layer, which is that one is slave-free. We can't speak for the other ones. If the other ones don't want to be part of this, and this is what we want to achieve, right? We want to achieve a kind of a magnet economy. That is, if you want to be part of this economy for things that are proved to be made in freedom, then you've got to join. You've got to meet all the standards on a constant basis, and then we'll help you communicate that to the audience.
So
if you don't want to be part of it, that's fine. It's completely.
I do want to challenge you just a bit, but I know that, for example, in criminal law, and as being the lawyers and presenting the future law here, there is an assumption of, help me out, Margaret, of innocent. So, presumption of innocence, right? So wouldn't you say that with this type of a labeling, what we are actually achieving is that the consumer doesn't really have this presumption of innocence on the other side, because what they see is that a product actually has that benchmark and a product doesn't. So I actually am making now the assumption that whomever doesn't is indeed actually a criminal and is not really being part of the slave-free trade. So instead of going,
I can't speak to your mental processes, but I can tell you it's not a court of law, right? It's about being able to influence people in the right direction, push them in the right direction. So the intention is it's a court of psychology, not a court of law.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, we're not trying to prove things in a court of law.
Right. How would the slave-free trade label differ from a fair trade label?
Well, the first big difference is that we're a human rights standard, not an equal profit standard, right? So our standard is derived.
What's the latter thing you said? Not a what profit standard?
It's not an equal profit standard, right? Fair trade is an equal profit scheme. It's got some human rights measures in there. For example, they don't want anybody in there with child labor,
right?
But it's not a human rights standard. It doesn't measure and assess human rights in workplaces. It doesn't do that in real time. It doesn't do that all the time, and it doesn't do that in the majority of workplaces.
But it does measure slave-free. It does measure human trafficking.
No, it doesn't.
Fair trade.
So those are in the standard, but the standard that they back that standard up with an audit system. Audit is an old model, which is that humans go out in a very small percentage of a supply chain, take a Polaroid and say everything's okay.
Okay, so that's the difference. So that is the difference.
That's one of the many differences. The only thing in common, in fact, there are two things in common. We both have trade at the end of the name, and we're both intending on, or we intend on putting labels on products as well. So we use the social label to provoke certain behaviors from certain people. So that's where it stops in terms of being in common. It's a human rights standard, and it's about measuring those human rights in workplaces in a completely provable way in real time all the time. If you join, for example, Fair Trade, you've got the periodic audit that goes on in a small percentage of workplaces. And then there's a process, of course, which is a bit like B Corp certification. They obtain the corporate view of what's happening in a workplace. So there is a process where they'll say, do you have a child labor policy? Do you have a grievance resolution mechanism, etc.? So they take the corporate view, just like B Corp does, just like Global Reporting Initiative does. They take the corporate view, but in Fair Trade, as in B Corp, as in Global Reporting Initiative, a couple of big pieces are missing. One of them is that it treats an organization as if it's a single entity, rather than being part of a network. No company is an island, no organization is an island, they all have networks. So there are relationships there. So it's important to be able to use those, identify and use those relationships as leverage to improve everybody's performance. So that's not something you achieve in any of these other processes. And the other really big important thing, in none of these other systems do they go beyond the corporate view. In none of them do they constantly, clinically cultivate or curate the individual view of what's happening in workplaces. And I don't know about your experience of workplaces, but my experience in my workplaces has always been very personal. I really am the best arbiter of my own conditions and my happiness with those conditions. My lived life is my experience. And the corporate view with B Corp, Fair Trade, etc., it doesn't capture the individual experience. So a company saying it has a child labor policy, a fair trade company saying it has a child labor policy, that is not the best arbiter, if you like, of whether a workplace has child labor or not.
Right. So no, I'm hearing you, but I do want us to ensure that we are, setting out the parameters of what we're seeing correctly and fairly as well, because I do think fair trade sets out to address issues of human trafficking and slavery and child labor in their process. I'm hearing you that
in their process.
Yeah,
the process is very limited. Yeah.
Right. And so what slave-free trade is doing that is different is that you're doing far more than just an audit or just asking the company certain things. And so
and with a complete human rights framework,
not just
saying, you can't see, the thing is with modern slavery, you can go into a workplace and there can be two people alongside each other, one in modern slavery and one not. Modern slavery is not a legal definition, right? But it could be a human trafficking case alongside a case that is not in the very same workplace. These definitions become a bit irrelevant. So one of the real problems, and this is why the numbers around modern slavery are just so awful, they're just so badly, estimated, is that there's a serious definitional problem when you're trying to define and identify conditions that are criminal and covert. You have a real problem quantifying that. So the numbers rely on definitions where the definitions are extremely variable. They're changed from country to country, from place to place. And the data collected on those is also different. So we don't need actually to get down in the weeds on the definitional difference between human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor, though. Right. We don't need to do that. What we can say, what is common to all of them, is that they are all a result of a workplace culture that has seen an erosion of human rights. Now, it's irrelevant, in fact, if that human right is about a person's passport being taken away, or that human right is about somebody being discriminated against, or somebody being sexually harassed, or somebody being abused. It's irrelevant for defining modern slavery what these lines are. A workplace that has eroded human rights, 1 or 100 conditions, could be modern slavery. Modern slavery is just this exploitative element where human rights have been eroded. So we focus too much on the let's say the bottom end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Human rights in workplaces exist on a spectrum. One end of the spectrum is modern slavery. It's kind of a murky pool down there where human rights are eroded. Could be one of many different human rights are eroded, but it's down there. At the other end of the spectrum is decent work, where everything's more rosy. And the whole idea, we visualize this as we have 10 principles, we have 100 indicators. So think about a shopping mall with 100 escalators. So every one of those indicators in our system is a human rights condition. So 100 escalators on those human rights conditions. And the idea is you could be going really well on 99 conditions, but one of them you're down in the pool. You're really awful on it. So you could be modern slavery, or you could be mediocre on 50 and really low on 20, and you've got a modern slavery problem on your hands. So it's about the erosion of human rights and the degree to which human rights has been eroded and what human rights have been eroded.
Are you linking I know you said modern slavery doesn't have any established definition, but it seems to me that you are linking modern slavery to breach of human rights.
To what, sorry?
Breach of human rights. To human rights.
We link modern slavery to international human rights law, and an erosion of any of those rights in a workplace
is modern slavery.
Is modern slavery, exactly.
Okay.
Sorry, are you actually offering, with that indexing and the work that you do, new modern definition of a modern slavery as well? So many different modern words, but are we in a need of that definition as well? Because what I heard before was that we are fed up with just having these different laws that are not really being implemented in practice. And this is why we, and you especially, are invested so heavily into changing the market behavior, because obviously legal enforcement hasn't been enough or hasn't even been effective.
Yeah, and legal and let's face it, if we're talking about conditions in workplaces globally, exploitation is a framework, is a model. It's what Milton Friedman said all businesses should do. And so millions of business people all over the world go out and do it. They don't give a shit about the people in the workplaces. And that exploitation has been completely encultured in workplaces. So what we actually need to do is rethink how we think about workplaces and think about them not in terms of human resource management and personnel pulse surveys, but actually fundamentally thinking about the human rights of the individuals in workplaces. And let's try and measure that. And if that's going well, human rights in workplace, I mentioned that it's on a spectrum. One end of the spectrum is modern slavery, the other end is decent work. Like any spectrum, the two conditions can't coexist. You can't have respect for human rights and modern slavery in the same workplace. You can eradicate modern slavery by proving respect and improving respect for human rights in workplaces. So we have an index of 100 indicators from international human rights law that when you put them together, we aggregate them as 10 principles. When you put them together, that equals decent work. And so what we can do is we can tell you which step on all 100 escalators you are on at the moment, based on your corporate view, plus the view of every single person in your workplaces, because we're talking to them all on a constant basis. So every single person in every single workplace gets 100 questions a year. It takes between 10 and 15 minutes a year to participate. So on that basis, we get a really good picture of workplaces, right? A 1,000 person workplace is getting 9,000 questions a month. So the dials are spinning, and we can tell you which step on the escalator you're on. And over time, we can tell you whether you're moving up or down on each of those escalators.
And is there any incentivization for the workers? I mean, we obviously share the same values and are aiming in the direction where we are, free of the slave trade. I hope that in one point we will achieve that. But is there any incentivization for the workers as well for them to go through that questionnaire, or is it just like we share the same values, we want the same things, so this is why we participate in the whole thing?
Yeah, no. So one of the really interesting things, and this is what there's been a couple of companies out there doing. They call it worker voice tech, which is just the most terrible colonial phrase, but it's technology to speak to people in workplaces, staff in the not workers, which we tend to use just for the developing world. So this technology that is used to ask to speak to people in workplaces in real time and ask them questions. They call it worker voice. A couple of really good projects have been done on this in the past. There's been, and one of them, one very good one was Labor Voices. Now, one of their very early learnings was that people in workplaces think very differently about being asked about their human rights conditions as opposed to being asked their human resource questions. It's a very, very different thing. It's more visceral. People want to participate. They want to talk about this. And they, the feedback we've had, we've just run 3 pilots so far, but the feedback in those pilots is overwhelming. I don't know whether you know, but with the very classic human resource surveys, there's this section at the end for, do you have anything to say? Do you have any comments you want to make? And 99.9% of the time, they're just always blank. We've had a phenomenal response in the workplaces, people adding comments in there completely unexpectedly, saying they love this, they want to be part of this, they're so grateful we're asking. It's really cool. But that's the only incentivization of that. The other incentivization is kind of, I haven't even gone into the kind of trust building theory of change around slave-free trade, right? There are 3 broken relationships that have actually caused us to be where we are, with 152 million people in child labor and tens of millions of people in modern slavery. We're talking about a broken relationship between employer and employee, between supplier and producer, and between consumer and retailer. So everything we do in our behavioral model is tested against how it builds trust. So at the employer-employee level, it's really important for us that the employer comes to the system voluntarily to slave-free trade. They introduce us to their staff, they connect us to their staff, and then their staff voluntarily enroll and participate in the system. Having taken out the employer from that, the employer just introduces them to the system. And it's a bit like that trust building exercise that you do on team building days, where the boss has to stand on a chair blindfolded and fall backwards into the arms of their staff. It's like one big version of that. The employer brings them in and then falls back into the arms of their staff. And we are relying, for the individual view, we're relying on the aggregated responses of people in workplaces. They want to be a part of that. What's completely untested yet is whether they'll continue to want to be part of that if the employer, for example, doesn't build feedback in, if they don't respond to issues that need to be fixed. I mean, in our system, they'll actually get ejected if they start not responding to things. But at the same time, they could also be doing okay and not improving. And people in workplaces who are giving feedback that are looking for change, if they don't get a sense that the employer cares anymore, they'll stop, they'll lose interest, right? That's natural. So we don't know that, that's a longitudinal thing. We won't know that for some time, whether that, how employer responses to issues impacts the continuing engagement of individuals in workplaces. But we don't seek to incentivize that engagement by staff in workplaces. We don't seek to incentivize that in any other particular way. We wouldn't encourage, for example, payment to participate, because that it changes the dynamic as soon as you start introducing incentives like payment to participate. You've got to make it easy, you've got to make it fast, and you've got to make it something that doesn't cost them anything to do. So we did a pilot in Colombia where SMS was going to kill us, right? We're a volunteer NGO, we have no income. So having to do something by SMS would have just been a disaster for us, but also a disaster for the staff in the plantation, because it would have cost them SMSs to send to us. So we had to actually come up with something else. We came up with a microservice using programmable SMS, which made it vastly cheaper. So we've got to find ways to make it fast, easy, and convenient for staff in workplaces. And they do then want to tell us about their human rights conditions. I've talked a lot, but there it is.
Yes, and I actually do want to come back to something Anya said at the beginning, one of the first question, because I'm thinking about how you are defining modern slavery, and as a breach of.
I mean, what we're really defining is that there is a set of human rights in workplaces by which we can judge whether a place has respect for human rights or doesn't.
I
And they're
can see
bad,
that.
then that could be modern slavery. Yeah.
And that is shifting the bar. It could be creditable work. I'm all for what you're doing. You know that I'm passionate about what you're doing in the world. But to define breaches of human rights as modern slavery, that is going beyond the legislative frameworks that we have started to see propagating around the world around modern slavery, right? So modern slavery, yes.
Well,
so modern slavery has been defined in the UK and in the US.
I think it depends on the location, because every time there's a modern slavery act developed, they have to redefine it for themselves. So when the UK Modern Slavery Act came out, they had to come out with their own statement, a new definition of what modern slavery actually means. And it's happening the same way everywhere these things are rolled out. It's being redefined every day.
Yes, but the definitions are loosely, all of them are around forced labor, servitude, and that sort of thing, ownership, exploitation of labor.
I think you'll find most of the definitions of modern slavery that have emerged actually revolve around the exploitation of others in labor for labor. That's so, it doesn't specify. It has become, or it is an umbrella term for those old four conditions, the forced labor, child labor, etc. But in fact, most of the definitions now coalesce around the fact that it's actually just exploitation in workplaces, arguably, when you boil it down. So that's where they're all coming out, which is not different to what we're talking about. We're just giving it 100 indicators to say this is how we judge it.
It's interesting. The exploitation of works. I mean, the
exploitation of others in workplaces. Yeah,
that is such an ambiguous, broad.
Yeah, and I do want to say, but let me just get this point across, because there are very clear conditions, for example, in the Modern Slavery Act in the UK and in other jurisdictions that I know of that have passed their slavery acts that are very specific about the acts of exploitation, and they are not as broad as every human rights, possible human rights infringement. And you have a label that says slave-free trade.
Slave-free, yeah.
Right, but it's much broader. Your definition of modern slavery is much broader, which actually...
Because you've got to go broader to be safe, right? The definitions are so gray.
Yeah.
The concept of exploitation, for example, is so incredibly subjective that you've got to go well beyond it. Otherwise, you've got a real risk of being caught in some kind of man trap down there in the murky definitional areas. So we go well beyond that. We prove a good workplace. And so the alternative, of course, we have, so the slave-free. So the interesting thing is that because we're talking about something that is consumer-facing, and I'm talking professional and amateur consumers, right? Public procurement as much as individuals in stores. We're talking about the court of consumer psychology, as I said before, not the court of human rights law. So when we say slave-free, that's an interesting differentiator for organizations or companies in particular that are producing something that comes from a global commodity chain that has a problem, has a perceived public problem with modern slavery. So cocoa, coffee, rubber, rice, tea, sugar, meat, tulips, etc. They've all got a serious problem with modern slavery in their chains, right? So companies that are doing those things, for us, they're interested in our logo and concept and to communicate to consumers slave-free. There are others, however, that aren't mired in the same public perception around their commodity chains, and they're interested in the made in freedom concept because that's beyond slave-free, right? We talk about made in freedom is a product where we can prove that there's been respect for human rights through the chain, blah, blah, blah. But they're communicating to a different, when somebody comes through our system, they can claim made in freedom. But some businesses, many businesses, in fact, in these cocoa chains and so on, they don't want made in freedom because that doesn't speak to their consumers. Their consumers are interested in that chocolate being slave-free. You can put made in freedom on it, but the consumers may not react the same way. So it very much depends on the public perception of what that commodity chain looks like.
Yeah, because slave-free certainly is a psychological trigger.
It is a trigger.
Yeah, it's a trigger. Absolutely. And it comes back to the point I think Anya was making at the beginning, that when a consumer comes into a store and sees slave-free on one product and doesn't see anything else on another product, then it's almost as if that psychological trigger with product A that has slave-free is going to compel them to buy there. But is that fair? Is that fair when the product that doesn't have it on it, really, you really cannot see that they are not slave-free? We can just say they haven't gone through your process to get the slave-free label.
Well, any other organization in the world can put slave-free on their product. You know, there's products on the market now that label themselves slave-free,
Right.
and it's all rubbish, right? It's based on a very, very poor quality standard. So the idea was, well, if you're going to call something slave-free, make it bloody slave-free. Stop all the bullshit marketing. So our goal is to eliminate all the greenwashing around it. So in fact, one of the very first things we did when I first started slave-free trade was to contact all the companies that market themselves as slave-free and say, we'll offer you free verification.
How did that go?
Zero took us up on the offer of free verification.
Wow. So tell us, so 2016.
And you know, and in just saying that, that's exactly like with the what you're proposing before, Anya, with the label, right? You're leaving this, I'm leaving you a doubt, right? So I've just said that all the companies in the world that call themselves slave-free, that they're out there, we approached them all and offered them free verification. They all said no thanks. So I'm not saying anything about how they do their slave-free, and I'm not saying they are slave-free or not. Right. I'm just saying we offered them free verification and they say no. And it's the same with the label. You've got to make up your own mind based on the evidence available. So in a store, looking at two T-shirts, one of them says slave-free, one of them doesn't. It's completely up to you as an individual based on your own values and your own psyche, which one you're going to go with. Where does your conscience tell you to go? And the vast majority of people, because they're quite triggered by the word slave, most people look at it and say, well, I don't want the one that's not. And that's absolutely fine, because that's actually a commercial decision. And the business that is putting the shirt on the shelf that is not slave-free and is not trying to become slave-free or not being able to tell you that it is slave-free, they're also making a commercial decision. Their commercial decision is that they don't think their consumers care. So 90% of companies we speak to, they say they don't think their consumers care, which I think is absolute crap. Consumers do care. They just don't have a way to channel that communication. So we want to be able to channel that communication for them. So.
Which is why I think, I mean, there's a real nexus between the work you're doing and public procurement, because public procurers are far more sophisticated than the average consumer that walks into a store, and have public procurers also have the machinery to be able to say, okay, what's the slave-free trade label? Let's verify that it's doing what it says it's doing, endorse it, and then layer that as a condition, a specification when they're going out to tender. So, I mean, there's a real opportunity, I think.
Yeah. Well, with public procurement, it's interesting because the difference between the amateur and the professional consumer in this sense is that the professional consumer has an evaluation grid. And so in that evaluation grid, they are deciding, or the representatives of the people are deciding what is important to them. And if, for example, social sustainability is important, then there'll be a piece of the evaluation grid that relates to that social sustainability. If it's not important, it won't be there, and so it won't be factored in. So the emotion of slave-free is taken out of it at that point, but the requirement or the possibility for a product to be human rights compliant as one bid among 5 that is proven human rights compliant, then the category manager still has a decision to make. And it's a little bit about their emotion, their feeling about it, but it's actually more about the evaluation grid. If the evaluation grid doesn't have human rights or social sustainability or compliance in there, then it doesn't get considered, and it won't be considered.
Brian, you seem to have lost your video.
Sorry. Let me switch the video off and turn it back on again and see.
What were you going to say, Anya?
It sounds as if we are having not really so much of a power play, but it really is a game of who is going to be taking the responsibility for establishing these standards and to get us from the slave trade into the world where we get rid of the slavery. It sounds as if we have so many different actors, and each of them, I mean, like you said it before, it's not like a company is an island in this game.
Yeah.
We are in this together, and we should be taking the responsibility collectively. But it's just, I as a consumer can make a decision, but I always want to do an informed decision. So it is always going to be a legit question whether this information that is presented to me is enough, or should I get more and more information in order to really make an informed decision at the end, and feel responsible to contribute to whatever decision making as a whole we are creating. Now, each of these actors has a different responsibility, and you really are creating a chain of all these responsibilities. But it's a megalomantic project. It's really complex. I mean,
Well,
how do you make sense of it?
Yeah, and but it is that kind of project, right? It is. We are not trying to just build an app. We're not trying to build a consumer app that looks at sustainability ratings on clothes and says, "Oh, that's a smiley face jacket, or that's a sad face pair of boots." We're not just an app, right? It's a complete behavioral loop. So the consumer in a store who cares about whether a product is made slave free or not. And by the way, I'm trying to fix my video here, but it just doesn't seem to want to go. My laptop is an old one. So it's okay. Is it okay if I just keep talking regardless of the video? Or?
Well, yes, please keep talking.
I'm trying to fix the video, but in the background, I'll just keep talking. So,
yeah.
Where was I? Yeah, no, it's really important to speak with lots of different audiences and get them to each act in the way that they can. So one of the really interested audiences for us is the world of investment. So investment managers are kind of the meat in the sandwich between investors and investees. And the investment manager gets told by the investor, okay, or the investors, okay, here's $600 million, but don't put it into human rights abuses. Right. And the investment manager is like, well, what the hell am I supposed to do with that? There's nothing they can do. But things start to change dramatically if they're starting to be able to figure out or be informed about what's going on in the business network and supply chain of their investees, right? It's a whole new world. And so suddenly you'll get, so what we're talking about then from a decision intelligence perspective, from a social labeling perspective, is a company that is at the top of its human rights compliant, a slave-free, maiden-freedom supply chain or network. They are listed on the New York Stock Exchange Connect app with our logo next to their name. Okay.
Yeah, so you're talking about all the people that may have an interest.
Different actors that can have an interest and can change things, can change the world, in fact, by using the power of their purchasing.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said 2016, you woke up, you had this idea. Yes. You had it up, you had the conceptualization of it in a few hours.
Yes.
And the beginning of a manifestation of it in a few hours.
Yes.
We're in 2021 now. What has happened? What have you done with this idea and this?
So we've been 2 years old twice. So we're a 4-year-old organization that has just had its second birthday. So like all startups, dissolved, started again. Right? Didn't have any money, ran out of money, started again. So I funded the entire thing by my savings. So this is kind of, we're at the end of that particular road, let's say.
Oh,
but we've now
don't I know it?
We've now got that's the feeling. So when your credit card bounces when you're trying to buy milk, you just know that something's not right there. So this is but that's where we're at.
So what drives you and motivates you to do this, Brian? Brian, what is driving you and motivating you to do this? I really want to get to that hope.
The face of the boy shot in the head and dumped overboard, right? It's not a haunting. It's someone that needed someone to speak for them. So that's arguably that's really all it is. So and once you get invested in this kind of a subject, you just can't let it go, like a dog to a shoe. So I started twice, and so the very first big hurdle we came to was that there was no definition of decent work that it was in an operational sense that we could use. So there were the different conventions and points of international law, and the UN Charter and the Human Rights Covenants. And then you, at the other end of the scene, you look at the business and human rights field, and you say, okay, well, we've got the Ruggie principles, which are lovely for advancing the conversation, but they're actually not very useful for operationalization. You can't use that as an investigator in the field, and what we actually need is something we can use as an investigator in the field, in a way, and then automate it. So there was this need to define what we were talking about. What does a good workplace look like? If you're only talking international human rights law, is there sufficient international human rights law to say that? That was the very first question. So we had to look at all of the different points of parts of international human rights law, and see whether that was possible to come up with a definition that was purely international human rights law. And let me just emphasize here the importance of that, because what we wanted to achieve was that a person whose human rights in a workplace are being protected, it shouldn't matter to us, and it shouldn't matter to anybody whether they're in a plantation in Guatemala or an office in a bank in New York. Their human rights are the same. Universality of the international human rights covenants means that if we can come up with a definition of decent work that only comes from all the points of international human rights law, then we can transcend the really quite problematic differences you get from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from organization type to organization type. You can also, and between goods and services. So we wanted to build a framework that would define international human rights, define human rights conditions in workplaces from a universalistic perspective, so that it was perfectly applicable in one workplace on one side of the world and one workplace in another, and transcend socioeconomics, transcend jurisdiction, transcend good or product or organization type. So that's what we did. Big piece of work. It took us 2.5 years. During which time we dissolved and started again. So we created this framework. That was the first big piece. And then the second big piece is turning that into something that you can operationalize. So what we did was I looked at actually went back to the quite basic things about my investigations. The last 20 years, I've been doing slavery investigations and operations. So looking at investigative techniques, and tried to work out what of those investigative techniques we could automate. Because ultimately we're talking about 150 million children in child labor and 40 odd million humans in modern slavery. We're not talking about something that cannot that can be solved by having someone like me go out and do an ad hoc investigation, right? The scale is not there. You can't photocopy investigators. Mm-hmm. So we had to come up with something that would be automatable. And by doing so, what we're trying to do is get to the majority of workplaces, instead of taking the kind of audit methodology where you just go to the minimum number of workplaces that your sample size can allow. We want to get to the majority of places with a remote system, and then if something needs investigation, something needs triage, we can go and look in more detail with humans. So building a remote monitoring system means automating. So we created these processes. So our system has 4 core processes. We call it member operations. So Slave Free Trade's a membership organization. Any organization, our unit of measure is workplaces and people, not products or services or anything. Our unit, if you've got workplaces and people, you can be human rights compliant, which is great for a workplace, right? So 4 core services, I should say, through which we tell whether a place is human rights compliant or not. The first one is, I mentioned before, the corporate view. This is this kind of desk audit. Do you have a child labor policy? Do you have a grievance resolution mechanism? Does it have these characteristics and so on? That's the corporate view, like is captured in a number of other places. And for example, in a modern slavery statement, if you submit a modern slavery statement, you're providing the corporate view. And then there's the individual view. So we call it a process called workforce assessment, where we ask every single person in every single workplace who wants to participate. It's all voluntary. We ask them 100 questions a year on a monthly basis. And so we're kind of constantly getting updated on what's going on in workplaces. And then we have a network component. So that is an organization joins and they're asked to bring their network in. So
chocolatier joins, invites cocoa processor, invites plantation, and we link them so that thereafter their performance is reliant on each other's performance.
Yeah.
So you can't, so the chocolatier at the end can't put a chocolate bar on the shelf unless the processor and the plantations are all human rights compliant too. So they've all got to go through the process. And then they become really interesting already just in the first pilot, which, as I said, is one chain, 3 tiers. Already in that process, we've seen disaggregated supply chain actors, which is classic in supply chains these days. It's the Alibaba effect. It's the decoupling of business relationships where you don't need to give a shit how the widgets are made. You can just order them on the internet. So we're trying to, what we've already seen is a kind of a reversal of that, or a turnaround on that, where suddenly these actors know each other better than they did before. You know, they're no longer just a blank, just a number in the checkbook or a number in the account system. They've actually got names and faces and human rights standards, and you know how many staff they have and what conditions they're in. And so suddenly you have this incredible knowledge of what's going on in those workplaces, and you're reliant on them being human rights compliant for your product.
Right.
So suddenly they're collaborating networked organizations.
So how far are you now? How
the
far are you?
anti-Alibaba.
Yeah.
So we've just done these first 3. We've just done the first 3 workplaces. We're just
So have
finishing
you, wait, so you've said there are these 4 processes that you
the 4
take.
core processes, yeah.
4 core processes. Have you automated all of these processes?
No, they're all manual at the moment with a few tech tools to help.
Tools.
So with tech tools, so what we do is, you know, we've got a big tech team, and what they're doing is coding madly in parallel to the manual application of the processes.
Okay.
So let me give you an example with the workforce assessment piece. This is where we ask questions of people in workplaces. You know, we started with just a survey, and then used an online survey tool, and now we've just finished a smartphone application for that, for places where there is smartphone. And then we also just built a microservice for analog phone.
What online survey tool did you use? This is just for my own research.
Qualtrics.
Qualtrics, nice. I'm using that right now as well. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm not sure we're going to be able to stay with it because it's too expensive for us.
It is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very expensive. So we're just evaluating that right now. But it's Qualtrics at the moment, embedded in our own smartphone application.
Right.
Or as a URL, and then we've got this microservice we've just done for analog SMS. You know, we want to get to the majority of people in global commodity chains, which means that we can't just stick with smartphones. Smartphones useful for a foundation in Stockholm, or a business office in New York, or even an office in Bogota, but it's not so useful when it comes to a cocoa plantation in the north of Colombia. There's this analog divide. We call it the analog wall within slave-free trade. So, you know, we've already hit the analog wall in our first pilot. Used programmable SMS to get over the wall in the first place. The results are not everything we would want, but it's a starting point. So that's where we are. We're building tech as we go, with mostly manual processing of those processes. So we have 4 teams for each of those core processes, and they go hands-on with clients doing this processing and coding in the background, and trying to raise money, right? Trying to find funds, because my savings are finished.
The bane of the social entrepreneur who is truly passionate about catalyzing what they want in the world, and are not waiting for the funding, not waiting just to pitch for the funding.
No, you can't wait for money. Money doesn't necessarily gravitate to good causes. In the time that I've been looking at this project, the money that we've seen go to completely half-assed projects and really small stuff that, you know, we could have got, I guess, maybe if we'd actually applied, but we don't apply because we just don't have the time to do it. We're kind of focused on getting to do what we want to do, and not letting a lack of money get in the way of that. So we have more than 120 volunteers now, spread out from Christchurch, New Zealand, to Seattle, United States. That's growing every week.
That's incredible. So what's the plan for sustainability for this organization?
So we're a membership organization. So in fact, we've got each organization that joins, the plan is they pay a membership fee. The membership fee is super cheap, right? It's for an SME. It's kind of for an SME of say 10 people, then it's the equivalent of one Microsoft Office license for one person in that team. It's that kind of pricing. And that's the kind of pricing all the way up the scale. You know, a $1 billion company is just paying $45,000 a year. So really, really small stuff. The price is designed to be a no-brainer. But the importance is the network effect. That is, we're working with supply chains. And the same excuse that the H&Ms of the world use to not address their supply chain, you know, complexity and distance and size, and we use that in our favor, right? That's going to be our revenue engine. When one company joins, they invite 5 more. And they become, if they're interested, then they become members, and then they pay, and then they invite 5 more each. So we intend, with a small fee, to get volume. So that's our revenue model, but it's got to get started. It's got to kick off.
Yeah, and I
before
think
it can snowball.
I think what is incredible about what you're doing.
So the business plan is solid. We just got to get there.
Right, and I think what is really incredible about what you're doing is, you know, your focus on the whole downstream supply chain, the whole global supply chain, cradle to cradle, and there may be again linkages that can be made between what you are trying to do and what people in the circular economy movement are trying to do by tracing and tracking supply chains and looking at the environmental impact of all the inputs coming in. So there may be some partnerships and networks you can look to tap into along that line as well. But I mean, it's been really incredible learning a bit about what you're doing and the important work that you're doing in the world, Brian. One final thing I would want to ask, I mean, what is your big ask in the world right now? What does slave-free trade need right now to catalyze you to the next level? What is your next big goal that you're trying to hit? And for any viewers who are listening, who are really passionate about slave-free trade and or have become passionate because of the stories that you've shared in this call, how can they get involved? Is there an avenue for them to get involved? And, you know,
Yeah. Okay. We have, you know, there are basically 3 ingredients needed to accelerate a project. Time and money are the big 2. Opportunity, of course, is the third, a bit of luck maybe, but time and money. And so as a volunteer organization, we have time, right? We have people. We have 120 people giving 5 to 10 hours a week. So we're for the moment, we're just embracing that we're a volunteer organization in the meantime. And we take all volunteers we can to increase the amount of time we can commit to developing the system and processes and servicing new members. Money, of course, is the thing we're operating without, and that could be a huge accelerator. So we've got a crowdfund starting next month on We Make It. It's the first fundraising we've really done, actually. So I'll be sending you information about that. But it's a crowdfund on We Make It starting next month. You know, grants and donations are something we really need to do. One of the things with grants is that we find we just don't have grant writing capacity internally. Everyone's focused on getting the job done. Fundraisers don't do things for free. So, you know, anybody who can help us with grants and grant applications, or with helping find us donors, very, very keen on that. Really keen on that, actually. Because cash is the only thing we're really lacking at the moment in terms of for acceleration.
right, because you have the technical expertise, you have the people building out.
We have the model.
You have the model.
Yeah, we have the model. We have the business model, the revenue model, I should say. So, you know, if things were accelerating at the pace I would like them to accelerate right now, by the end of this year, there'll be thousands of organizations in the system. And I'm talking organizations, right? Not just companies, right? There are NGOs out there. You know, if you're a human rights NGO, why wouldn't you want to be a human rights compliant one? That's, you know, and you look at the NGOs and the scandals they have around sextortion and harassment and gender pay gap and all sorts of scandals. Why wouldn't more non-profits, for example, want to be human rights compliant? Why wouldn't government departments? Why wouldn't UN agencies want to be human rights compliant with all of the scandals that have gone on in the UN system about free internships and bullying? And, you know, I think human rights compliance, it's the new HR.
Human rights compliance is the new HR. I love that.
Yeah. Well, human rights is the new HR. Yeah.
Human rights is the new HR. I like that.
Because ultimately you care about it more, right? Individuals care about it much more than whether they've got a dishwasher in their kitchen.
Yeah, for sure.
Human rights is more visceral, more fundamental. That's a good way to think about it, right? It's human rights. They're fundamental.
I think that's going to be the name of this conversation. Human rights is the new HR. Go ahead.
It
Anya.
happened. No, for sure. I
Right.
mean, it was actually lovely to hear you. And thank you for answering all the questions, because I know I kind of grew sometimes, especially from
Not at all. You did. No, you could have grilled me a lot more. No problem at all.
All right. You're ready for the round two. Gotcha on that.
Yeah.
I'm ready for round two. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for your time.